Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating analysis about the history of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. Now, if you follow global politics at all, you know the U.S. often positions itself as this ultimate moral leader. But as we're going to see from the source material, the reality is a lot more complicated. It's literally a pendulum swinging back and forth over the decades. So let me just pose this question directly to you. Has the U.S. always been the global champion of human rights? It's a compelling question, right? Because the texts we're looking at today reveal that the actual history is definitely not a straight line of advocacy. Instead, it's this incredibly complex landscape full of massive policy swings, competing priorities, and just raw geopolitical pragmatism that often completely overrides all that idealistic rhetoric. Now, to really wrap our heads around this history, we have to start with a core concept from the text: American exceptionalism. This is basically the belief that the United States is fundamentally different from, and, generally speaking, superior to most other nations. And that's largely because of its internal commitment to individual rights and democracy. The authors use this belief system as the ultimate lens for examining America's track record on human rights. It is the engine driving both its most idealistic interventions and, as we'll see, its biggest contradictions. All right, moving into Section 1, the post-war promise and building the international order. So the text describes the immediate aftermath of World War II as this period of absolutely massive American advocacy. Let's look at the timeline. In 1945, pushed hard by American NGO lobbying, the U.S. was totally instrumental in creating the UN. By 1946, you literally have Eleanor Roosevelt chairing the newly formed UN Human Rights Commission. It was a massive burst of enthusiasm. But look how quickly things stalled out. By the early 1950s, conservative lawyers and lawmakers started pushing the Bricker Amendment. The text points out this was driven by deep fears of compromised sovereignty and what they called backdoor communism. And then, by 1953, the Eisenhower administration just officially announces it's backing away from negotiating multilateral human rights treaties. Just like that, the pendulum swings. Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. Cold War containment, security over rights. The text frames this whole era around a really stark contrast. On one hand, you have the rhetoric of freedom, the U.S. constantly proclaiming itself the leader of the free world. But on the other hand, you have the reality of anti-communism. To stop Soviet expansion, the U.S. enthusiastically backed right-wing, anti-democratic regimes. The source specifically calls out American support for coups in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 54, and Chile in 73, all just to prevent communist takeovers. Basically, human rights took a complete backseat to strategic rivalry. And the authors use this famous quote to brilliantly illustrate that exact mindset. Attributed to FDR regarding Nicaragua's dictator, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, it goes, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." It perfectly captures the raw, pragmatic calculations that completely dominated policy back then. As long as a leader was anti-communist, their actual human rights record, that was often completely overlooked. Which brings us to Section 3, the human rights revival, detente to the post-Cold War. As Cold War tensions finally started relaxing in the mid-1970s, the text shows human rights making a pretty remarkable comeback. You can trace this revival through some key milestones from the source material. First, Congress steps up with the 1974 Trade Act, specifically the Jackson-Vanik provision, denying trade preferences to countries restricting emigration, taking direct aim at the Soviet Union. Then, the 1975 Helsinki Accords provided actual protections for dissidents. By 1977, the Carter administration issues PRM 28, which creates dedicated human rights bureaus right inside the State Department. And that momentum carried straight into the 90s, with the Clinton administration lobbying to create the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It was a time when the policy space really opened up for human rights to return to prominence. But the authors are careful to point out that these gains were sometimes, mostly symbolic. And more importantly, they were constantly being interrupted by new geopolitical crises, things like the Iranian Revolution or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which would just violently force the pendulum right back towards security concerns. Jumping ahead to Section 4, the Trump-era departure, a radical reversal. The source text characterizes the 2017 to 2020 period as a really significant departure from established bipartisan norms, and the administration was totally explicit about it. Look at this quote from former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson back in 2017. He essentially argued that if we condition our relationships too heavily on human rights, it actually creates obstacles to advancing our national security and economic interests. The text highlights this as a purposeful, open de-emphasis of human rights, heavily favoring a much more transactional, deal-making approach to global affairs. Now, what's really interesting about this is how that rhetoric translated into very specific unilateral actions. The source outlines a few major moves. In 2018, the U.S. abruptly withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council. The administration also largely ignored humanitarian concerns during the Yemen civil war to preserve security relationships. The text notes a pattern here, praising authoritarian leaders while only using human rights rhetoric selectively, mostly against perceived enemies. They even created this Commission on Unalienable Rights, which the text observes was widely read as a deliberate effort to narrow the scope of what human rights even are, a fiercely unilateralist approach.
Let's look at the reaction in Section 5. Congressional pushback, a bipartisan response. Because this executive departure didn't just happen in a vacuum. The authors interpret the resulting pushback as a crucial piece of evidence. It shows that, despite the executive branch pivoting away, a real commitment to human rights is still deeply embedded in American political institutions. Basically, Congress woke up and started aggressively asserting its independent legislative role in foreign policy. To illustrate this, the text gives us some really powerful examples. Both houses of Congress actually passed a bipartisan resolution to end military support in Yemen, though it's worth noting the president ultimately vetoed it. Congress also completely defied the executive branch by officially recognizing the 1915 Armenian massacres as genocide. And they passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act to address the massive detentions happening in China. These were clear, concrete instances of Congress using its independent power to force human rights back onto the agenda.
Bringing us to our final section, Section 6, the exceptionalism paradox. Bringing our narrative completely full circle, the text introduces this crucial and, frankly, controversial variant of American exceptionalism called exemptionalism. This is the idea that American domestic institutions are just so robust that the U.S. actually necessitates exemptions from the very international human rights rules it demands everyone else follow. It's essentially the mindset that these rules are for them, but definitely not for us. So the crucial point is how this exemptionalism plays out in the real world. The text points out some truly stark contradictions. For example, the U.S. is all for prosecuting other people for war crimes, but absolutely refuses to join the International Criminal Court itself. It denied the protections of the Geneva Convention to detainees at Guantanamo Bay, arguing that international law somehow just didn't apply there. And, wild as it sounds, the U.S. remains the only country in the entire world that is not a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. As we wrap up this historical overview, the source text makes it super clear that these contradictions aren't just accidents. They highlight the immense structural difficulty the United States faces when trying to balance its genuine historical commitments to human rights against its massive global security and economic goals. The pendulum is literally always swinging. Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question directly inspired by the text. If the world's most powerful democracy treats international human rights as optional, what does it actually mean for the future of global freedom? It's definitely something to chew on as you watch global events continue to unfold. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.